Rabbi Sherman, who has worked incredibly hard preparing our adult engagement opportunities this summer. And I want to thank Rabbi Sapphire, who's been working with our youth, and really thank our entire temple team for planning a summer full of programming. As you well know, this year is very different than years past. Rather than slowing down during the summer, we have actually increased our opportunities for engagement in prayer and in Torah and in social justice as well. And so I hope you'll continue to stay involved in the life of our community this summer. I'll actually be teaching 2 courses this summer, starting very soon. One on my favorite verses in the entire Torah, with each class focusing on one specific verse. And then I'll be teaching a second course beginning in a couple of weeks on the American Jewish experience in film, where we'll watch Hester Street and the movie The Chosen, and for the last session, a movie called Avalon from 1990, a film that many of you may remember. Avalon tells the story of a Jewish family assimilating in America, in Baltimore in the 1950s. And one of the most memorable scenes in the entire film actually takes place on the holiday of Thanksgiving, when the entire family excitedly gathers around the Thanksgiving table with the sanctity and decorum of Passover, joyfully embracing that most American of American rituals, until one member of the family arrives to the home late and sees the rest of the family eating, and he yells at the top of his lungs, "You cut the turkey without me?" And immediately family chaos ensues. And I mention this scene not to focus on family issues or argument or banter or the dramatic arc of the film, but I mention this scene because of Thanksgiving and the role that civil holidays have always played in the life of the Jewish people. As the great Jewish historian Jonathan Sarna likes to say, when looking at the Jewish experience, when the Jews came to America, they became American, only more so. Meaning, if America celebrated a holiday, the Jews did too, only more so. If there was a great social issue of the day that required fighting and protesting and engaging, the Jews ran to engage and protest, only more so, embracing civic life and law and politics and education, always pushing to move our country forward towards the promised land. Which leads me to today and Juneteenth. For I believe that we as a Jewish community have an important role to play. For after all, we Jews are good at defining holidays of remembrance. And Juneteenth is still in its early stages. Yes, Juneteenth has been observed by Blacks in America since 1866. But it wasn't until 2007 when Governor Deval Patrick acknowledged Juneteenth as a state holiday in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It's a holiday that is now recognized by 48 other states in our nation, not yet Hawaii. And it was not until only recently, this week, when many companies actually made it a paid vacation day for their workers. But it was on this day, June 19th, 1865, 2.5 years after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and a full 2 months after General Lee's surrender at Appomattox, that Major General Gordon Granger arrived to the far reaches of the United States, that was then Galveston, Texas, and announced that the Civil War was over and that all slaves should be free. The scholars wonder why it took so long for this important news to travel to Texas. One theory is that a messenger was actually murdered along the way. And so it took a while for the message to travel and a new messenger ultimately be sent to Galveston. Another theory is that federal officials intentionally delayed the announcement to allow owners to keep their slaves for one last cotton harvest. But for whatever reason, June 19th became the day that in all of the United States of America, the word was proclaimed that all people should be free. And yet we all know that slavery did not end on that day. In fact, records showed that on some plantations in Texas, the masters never even announced the news to the slaves. Even in Galveston, the ex-Confederate mayor completely ignored Granger's decree and forced the slaves back to work. You could see lots of Black folks hanging to trees right after freedom, said Hayes Turner, a former slave. They whipped me after the war just like they did before, she said. And so if slavery and racism didn't really end on June 19th, why do we celebrate Juneteenth as a holiday? And for that, I think that is where our Jewish wisdom can come in. Because we too celebrate a holiday of freedom, Passover, a day that remembers that we were slaves 3,000 years ago. But what Passover does so well is not just recall that we were slaves in Egypt, but reminds us that the declaration of freedom is not where the journey ends, that there's still work to do in the pain and the hardship of the desert, the pain that we read about in this week's Torah portion. And there's still so much work to do to ultimately arrive to the promised land. And for me, that is Juneteenth, a day to remind us that there is still work to be done, that we as a nation have not lived up to the promise that all people should be free. On Passover, we're told to remember. It says remember over 120 times in the Bible. You were slaves in the land of Egypt. Exodus 22. Do not mistreat the widow or the orphan, because remember, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Deuteronomy 24, verse 17. Do not deny justice to the foreigner or the fatherless, because remember, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Deuteronomy 24, 19. If you are harvesting in your field and forget a sheaf there, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, the widow, the needy, because remember, you were slaves in the land of Egypt. We're told over and over again, remember, remember, remember. Remember your history so that you may gain strength to fight for justice and march to the promised land. Remember the events that you endured. Remember the people that have gone before you. Remember Eric Garner. Remember Trayvon Martin. Remember Michael Brown and Emmett Till and George Floyd and countless others. Not to live in the past, but to gain strength for the days ahead. So that one day, as our Torah tells us, we may proclaim liberty throughout the land through love and law and compassion, and recognize that every human being was created equal and created in the image of God. But we know it takes work. I do want to say this week, I'm thankful for the Supreme Court decision granting equal rights to our LGBTQ community. And I will save my comments for that historic judgment for another time. It is deserving of our attention. But when it comes to race in America, we have a lot of work to do. And on this Shabbat, the Shabbat of Juneteenth, I hope you've seen the lists from our Racial Justice Initiative. We will support Black-owned businesses, as you know, that continually confront the challenges of systemic racism. We'll work against economic disparity. left from decades of racism and discrimination. I hope you'll support our own Archie LaSalle. I hope Archie's on. He's a Shabbat regular. I hope he's here somewhere this evening, because Archie has created an effort called Where Are All the Black People At? He's done incredible work. Many of you know, Archie is an artist, a teacher, and a photographer, and now is one shining light who is bringing attention to the racism that pervades much of the art world, even right here in Boston. And we're going to marshal our forces to have a deeper presence of the Black community in our museums in Boston. You'll hear more in the week ahead. We'll support our own Ed Gaskin with his work in Grove Hall. We'll work on voter registration and combat voter suppression. We'll educate ourselves to be anti-racist. And I hope we'll lead the way in the national observance of Juneteenth, because my guess is that it will soon reach the House floor. It has passed the Senate, but it will reach the floor because we are witnessing the beginning of a unique time in history. As Archie said to me this week, as Archie protested during the 60s, he said, Rabbi, this is the 60s on speed. We are witnessing a new day, and now we're witnessing a new holiday as a result of these protests. And it's an important day, a day a long time in coming, and a day that we can help shape, a day that should challenge us to do the hard work that is necessary so that all people can arrive to the promised lands. And we Jews know how to observe holidays. We have lots of them, and it is time for us to observe Juneteenth with all Americans, only more so. Shabbat Shalom. Good Shabbos.